Welcome everybody. I am so excited to have y'all with me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I am the executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And today we are going to be going over a whole bunch of really, really interesting data with you. Um, for those of you who are new to the Environmental Voter Project, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on identifying environmentalists who don't vote and then mobilizing them to become new and eventually consistent voters. If you want more information on what we do, I'm sorry you're not going to get it today. We are going to be laser focused just on the early voting data that we're seeing. But if you look in the chat, you'll find links to learn more about our work. As you can imagine, if you're a nonprofit in the business of identifying low propensity climate voters and then mobilizing them to vote, we've got a lot of early vote data because we want to know which of our targets have voted yet and which haven't. And there's a lot of that we want to share with you, as well as some other interesting stuff that we're seeing. Before I jump into that, though, I do want to provide a few caveats. First, early vote data is not predictive of what the final tally will be. Actually, this is the only caveat I want to give, but I want to give two reasons for why it's not predictive. First, just because we know who has voted does not mean we know how they have voted. Not even every state provides party registration data about individual voters. The second reason why this can't be predictive of future results is we can't even make a good apples to apples comparison to previous presidential elections because so many intervening factors have scrambled up stuff so much that previous year's data really is pretty worthless, like a global pandemic or changing partisan views on early voting and mail voting, or an enormous number of states changing their voting logistics laws. So please bear with me that we're not going to be able to draw a ton of conclusions from what we're seeing, but I do want to tease out a few things. And as a reminder, there will be a Q&A at the end of this. You can put any questions in the Q&A folder, and we will be sharing some links in the chat. All right, let's get going. This is a lot. I know this slide is going to hurt your eyes. Don't worry, the next slide is a little bit clearer, but I think this provides a little bit of context. We have in each of our 19 states, which you see there, tracked turnout among all registered voters, and then also turnout among the registered voters who we've identified as being highly likely to list climate as their top priority. A few things you might start noting. In almost every state, people who are likely to prioritize climate change are outvoting the underlying electorate. There are a few states that I think are really noteworthy. Pennsylvania, and don't worry, I'll give you the precise numbers in the next slide. Nebraska, why is Nebraska important? Probably the closest US Senate race. Ooh, but Georgia, look, in Georgia, climate voters are undervoting the baseline of all registered voters in the state. But stay tuned on that. We've got some interesting things when we dive into that data. Maybe a clearer way to think about this is what you can see in this slide. So this is the same data as the last slide, but it shows where climate voters are overperforming the baseline of registered voters in the state and where they are underperforming. And you'll see they're overperforming in almost every state. And so what this means, for instance, is in Pennsylvania, registered voters who are likely to prioritize climate and other environmental issues are turning out so far at 9.1 percentage points higher than all registered voters in the electorate are turning out. But you'll see in Georgia and Louisiana, and a lesser extent, Texas, climate voters are underperforming the baseline electorate. All right. One thing that's difficult about this, though, is we don't know, at least by just looking at this data, well, does this mean that people who care about climate change are just going to be voting more often than the rest of the electorate? No, we don't know that. Similarly, we don't know, looking at this Georgia number, whether that means, oh my gosh, the environmental movement has a turnout problem in Georgia. Because many of these early voters could be people who were going to vote anyway. Maybe in the past they voted on election day, and now they're voting earlier because of the convenience. We don't know that just from looking at this data. But what we've done is we've dug a little bit deeper, and in the next two slides, you'll see we're going to isolate people who are first-time voters. Because the thing about first-time voters is it's a lot more likely that these are people who weren't just changing their voting habits. Why is it more likely? Because they don't have any voting habits. They're first-time voters. And so you can glean a little bit more information from that. These are people who are showing up who otherwise haven't shown up in the past. All right, here you see Pennsylvania first-time climate voters are still outvoting potential first-time voters across the whole electorate. Same thing in Nebraska. But look at that, it's flipped in Georgia. If you just look at the first-time voters, climate voters are outvoting first-time voters across the electorate. Also, you'll see in Texas, it's flipped as well. So let's look at that clearer version of this data like we did last time. You'll see here, if we're just looking at potential first-time voters, so these are people who are showing up in the voter file as being registered voters who haven't voted before, you'll see the turnout numbers. Well, you see in this previous thing, the turnout numbers are pretty low, right? As they should be. You don't expect people who have never voted before to show up in enormous numbers in early voting. But you'll see, to the extent that they are, Georgia and Texas have flipped, and Pennsylvania and Nebraska, we still have these first-time climate voters voting at a higher early voting clip than the baseline of all potential first-time voters. Where are they underperforming? North Carolina. To a lesser extent, Florida, Iowa. Don't poo-poo Iowa. 2 out of their 4 congressional seats are toss-ups. Iowa's going to be a very important state. But you'll see, by and large, not only are all climate voters early voting at a higher rate than all registered voters, but if you isolate these first-time voters, we still see that. Not consistently across the board, but we do see that. And we think this is a really interesting and perhaps a more valuable way to look at early voting data. Because if you don't just focus in on the first-time voters, you could just be seeing a whole lot of people who otherwise would have voted, and they're just voting at a different time. And that's actually not movement in one direction or the other, is it? All right. When we look at all of the potential first-time climate voters who we're targeting at the Environmental Voter Project, over 214,000 of them have already voted. I'll say that again. In these 19 states, the Environmental Voter Project, remember, we're in the business of identifying people who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet are unlikely to vote, which in a presidential year means they haven't voted before. Of those, we're targeting 4.8 million across 19 states, and almost 215,000 of them have already voted. And this is how they break down across the states. Now here, another caveat. Boy, are there a lot of caveats when you're talking about early voting. Different states are at different points in their early voting windows. And so just because 2 states of the same size, roughly the same size, have dramatically different numbers, don't read too much into that. Like Pennsylvania is a larger state than North Carolina, but early voting in Pennsylvania is very different from what it is in North Carolina, and there are far fewer early voting opportunities. And so overall turnout is much lower in Pennsylvania. But you'll see 33,521 of our targets at the Environmental Voter Project in Georgia have already voted. That's 33,000 first-time climate voters have already voted in Georgia. Over 7,000 in Pennsylvania, over 20,000 in North Carolina. Now, are we solely responsible for that? No, of course not. We happen to run randomized control trials so that after the election, we can see if what we're solely responsible for. But these are all of the targets of ours who have already voted. And I know we have a lot of Environmental Voter Project volunteers and donors watching this. And I hope you feel very proud of this. I hope you feel very, very proud of this. Almost 250,000 of the potential first-time climate voters we're mobilizing across 19 states have already cast their ballots. All right, I'm going to dig down into a few of the swing states that we work in because I know that those are states that people deeply care about. And I'm going to highlight both some interesting internal data and some interesting publicly available data that I think might be worthwhile for you all to look at. And then we'll have time for a few questions. But remember, we're keeping this really, really quick. Okay, what's some interesting stuff in Arizona? Look at what happened in 2020. So far in 2024, almost 1.2 million ballots have been cast, and almost 7,700 of EVP's targets have voted. You'll see overall, we're targeting about 230,000 potential first-time climate voters. If you look at some popular polling averages, you'll see that 538.com and Real Clear Politics have Donald Trump over Kamala Harris, 1.8 percentage points or 1.5 percentage points. All right, what is a data point that we're seeing in early vote data that might be of interest to you? Remember, I said it's very difficult to look back in time and make apples to apples comparisons to early vote data from 4 years ago. One way to cut through that a little bit is, as I referred to earlier, to isolate first-time voters. Because with first-time voters, you know they're not people who usually vote on election day and are just changing the time of their vote. Well, when we look at modeled party affiliation, what is modeled party affiliation? It doesn't mean that that's how those people are actually registered to vote. It means that data scientists have taken party registration, age, voting history, race, a whole bunch of other demographic information, and tried to model these voters' likelihood of voting one way or the other. So when we look at the way people are likely to vote, and this is in Target Smart early voting data, in 2020, at this point in time, 8 days before Election Day, Democrats had a 4.4 percentage point early voting advantage among first-time voters. Now, they have a 7.5 percentage point advantage among first-time voters. I think this is an interesting thing to bear in mind. A lot of people are looking at just all of the early vote data and they're saying, oh, you know, Republicans are winning here and Democrats are winning there. And they have no idea whether those people are super voters who always vote anyway. And they just decided to vote on a Friday instead of a Tuesday. But these are first-time voters, something that I think is very, very interesting. All right, in Georgia, you'll see, oh my gosh, are people voting in Georgia? Almost 2.7 million ballots have already been cast 8 days before Election Day. As I mentioned earlier, 33,000 of EVP's targets have already voted. These are people who are first-time climate voters. And overall, we're targeting almost 500,000 first-time climate voters in Georgia. You can see the polling averages right here. What's an interesting data point that we think you might want to look at? Again, I'm looking at first-time voters. I think there's a lot more interesting data there. 2020 at this point in time, women in the voter file were outvoting men among first-time voters in 2020 by 2.5 percentage points. Now in Georgia, among first-time voters, so we weed out all the people who are just voting at a different time but always vote anyway, women are outvoting men by 6.2 percentage points. Nebraska, remember, Nebraska is important because of that really, really close US Senate race. Real Clear Politics doesn't have enough data that they're putting together US Senate polling averages for this Senate race, but 538.com has incumbent Republican Deb Fischer up 1 percentage point in that polling average. You can see how many ballots have been cast already and how many targets we have. What's the interesting data point we see there? Again, we're looking at these first-time voters and their likely way of voting, their modeled party affiliation, not their actual voter registration, but what data scientists think in the predictive models that they've built is the way that these people will vote. They think. Obviously, they don't know. At this point in time, 8 days before Election Day in 2020, the party affiliation, the modeled party affiliation, I almost made that mistake myself, of first-time voters in Nebraska leaned 9.1 percentage points Republican. Now it leans 11.1 percentage points Democrat. A huge, huge shift. A huge shift. Now, to be clear, we would expect that, right? Nebraska usually, except for the 2nd congressional district, Nebraska usually isn't in play in presidential politics, and so you don't expect there to be a groundswell of support for early voting among people who are likely to vote Democratic. But boy, is this an interesting data point. But the number of first-time voters in Nebraska is pretty darn small so far. So don't read too much into this. All I'm saying is, among people who we know aren't just changing the moment in time in which they vote, but they're actually first-time voters, early voting looks a lot bluer than it did 4 years ago. All right, Nevada. You can see how many ballots have been cast in Nevada already and how many people were targeting at the Environmental Voter Project. You can see the polling averages there. There's been a lot of talk, maybe many of you have seen it, about how Republicans are doing really, really well in early voting data in Nevada. And that's true. As you can see, if you look at modeled party affiliation among all voters, Republicans are outvoting Democrats by 4.7 percentage points in Nevada. But if you look at these first-time voters, they're outvoting Democrats by less than 1 percentage point. Now, if you are someone who cares about Democrats winning Nevada, I'm not telling you this is good news, but I would suggest to you this is a lot better news than is often being reported, or at least not as bad as is often being reported. A lot of people are making it seem like Republicans are creaming Democrats in early voting in Nevada, and the truth is, almost all of that advantage is from people who are already really good voters, and they're just voting at a different moment in time. Now, tactically speaking, would you rather bank your votes early rather than hope that they're going to show up on Election Day? Of course. And so Republicans definitely have an advantage in early voting in Nevada, but it's not as big as is often being made out. North Carolina, huge, huge number of ballots have been cast in North Carolina. A huge, huge number. As you can see, of the 266,000 potential first-time climate voters we're targeting in North Carolina, almost 21,000 of those targets have voted. Here you can see the polling average in North Carolina. What are we looking at here? Again, pretty significant gender gap. I'm using the term gender gap. Please know that it is sex data in voter files rather than gender data. You'll see that among first-time voters, hopefully you now recognize why we're focused on first-time voters, because it clears out some of the ambiguity of referencing previous voting data. At this moment in time, 8 days before Election Day in 2020, women were outvoting men by 2 percentage points. Now they are outvoting men by 7.4 percentage points among first-time early voters. That's pretty significant. That's pretty significant, especially when you consider how many ballots have been cast. All right, we've got 2 more states that we're going to get into, and then I'll be able to answer a few of your questions. Pennsylvania. 1.2 million ballots cast, not as many as you've seen in other swing states. That's in large part because counties are only required to have ballots available in their county elections office. Now, some counties offer early voting in multiple satellite locations, but early voting in Pennsylvania is a different animal than it is in most other states. And so you're going to see fewer people casting early ballots in Pennsylvania than you are in other of the battleground states that people are paying attention to. We'll see we at the Environmental Voter Project are targeting 245,000 potential first-time climate voters, and over 7,000 of them have already voted. One thing that's really standing out to me in Pennsylvania, and this is not just looking at first-time voters, so this comes with a larger grain of salt than some of the previous data, is a real shift in the rural, suburban, urban divide of people who have voted already. You can see that in 2020, only 21% of early voters at this moment in time, so 8.8 days before Election Day, were rural. Now it's up to 28%. And look, especially among urban voters had over a third of the vote tally at this point in time 4 years ago, and now it's about a quarter. This tells me that late volunteer efforts in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are going to be of really, really high value. There are many, many more latent votes being left on the table in urban areas in Pennsylvania than there are elsewhere in Pennsylvania. As a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A, and they'll either be answered there or we can get to them in the Q&A session that will be starting in a few minutes. Finally, Texas. Very close U.S. Senate race. You'll see a huge number of ballots have been cast. One thing to bear in mind with Texas is people who vote by mail. Well, let me put this a different way. You are not allowed to vote by mail in Texas unless you are 65 and older, or maybe it's 60 and older. Peter will put the correct information in the chat, I'm sure. Or you need to do it by absentee ballot. And so what that means is the first few days, maybe even weeks of early vote returns skewed very old, very rural, particularly white in Texas. And so you'll really see a shift coming forward. That being said, we see even more of this rural shift in early vote data from Texas. Look at that. Look at that. 4 years ago, almost 44% of the early vote tally 8 days before Election Day was urban. Now it's not even 32%. So again, like Pennsylvania, when we look at Texas, whether you're in Harris County around Houston or in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, or whether you're in Austin or some of the other big cities, there's a lot of latent votes sitting on the table there. All right, we've got 8 days left. Many of you are volunteers and donors to the Environmental Voter Project. If you are, or even if you are not, we encourage you to get involved. As I mentioned, we have identified 4.8 million potential first-time climate voters at the Environmental Voter Project. We're mailing those people. We're sending them digital ads. We sent them postcards. We're knocking on doors, and we're making phone calls. Just in the last 5 days of the election, we are looking to fill 4,825 phone banking shifts. Please go to the link that's in the chat and sign up for a phone banking shift. If you don't want to volunteer, support a volunteer. Even though we only use volunteer phone bankers, that doesn't mean it's free. We've got to pay a lot of money for server space to make these phone calls. And so you can also make a donation. We will immediately put it in the field. And yes, we can still efficiently spend these donations right up until Election Day. All right, we now have time for a few questions. Please forgive me that it's only a few, but we did promise you this would only be 30 minutes long. And also, you probably want us to get back to work mobilizing voters. So, Peter, do we have a question?
Yeah, thanks so much. So there are a few questions that kind of boil down to what's the best thing to do between now and Election Day? So with only a week left, what does EVP suggest that we do to continue or amplify encouraging more first-time voters and undecided voters in states like Arizona? This is from Emmy. Especially if we're already canvassing and phone banking, are there more things that folks can do?
Great question, Emmy. More canvassing and more phone banking. The truth is, as a volunteer, right now, you some options are off the table. It's too late to mail things. It's too late to mail postcards. And so really the main thing that you can do is phone banking or door-to-door canvassing. Uh, the way that we think about this, looking at our data, is by looking at both effectiveness and efficiency. The most effective form of voter turnout intervention, by which I mean the one that increases the likelihood of voting the most per contact made, is door-to-door canvassing. It's door-to-door canvassing. But door-to-door canvassing isn't that efficient. You spend a 2-hour shift, even on like a weekday evening when everybody is home, maybe you'll have 15 people come to the door, 10 or 11 of whom are the actual people you're looking for. So you make 10 voter contacts over 2+ hours. Whereas in 2 hours on a phone bank, you might speak to 40 or 50 people. So phone banks are much more efficient, but they're not as effective. They do increase turnout, but they're not as effective. So figure out what works best for you and do that and do it over and over and over again. We've only got 8 days left, and time is now each campaign's most precious commodity. And then finally, I would suggest some places can still very efficiently place donations. For instance, at the Environmental Voter Project, I wake up early each morning. I look at what's called a pacing report. This is how many of the digital ads we have bought are actually being delivered up to the amount that we want to buy them at. Some of them are underperforming, and so we need to tweak our ad buy. Some of them are right up at 100%, which makes me think, you know what, we can spend more and still reach voters with the same level of efficiency. And so there are a lot of places, the Environmental Voter Project included, that can still use your donations. But if you're thinking about volunteering, do more. Do more phone banks and more door knocking. Peter, what else we got?
Thank you. So, how good do you think the polling has been so far, and how good do you think it will end up being?
Yeah. So, first of all, polls are not meant to be predictive. They're not meant to be predictive. And so, I'd say it's even inappropriate to discuss polls being good or bad based on what the ultimate results are. I think a very good analogy for this is your bathroom scale, right? You step on your bathroom scale, it tells you how much you weigh, hopefully accurately, but it's not going to tell you how much you're going to weigh 8 days from now. That's not what it's supposed to be. That's not what it's supposed to be. So what I can't say is whether the current round of polls are good in that they are going to be able to predict what's going to happen 8 days from now. What I can say, though, and here's where the bathroom scale analogy still holds true, is if you went into your bathroom right now and stepped on your scale, even if you have like a fancy one that tells you your weight to like 2 decimal points, would you believe it? No, that's not what a bathroom scale is supposed to do. And I caution all of you from looking at polls right now and expecting there to be a degree of precision that polls are just not meant to deliver. Polls are not meant to be precise within 2 percentage points. They're just not. Just like a bathroom scale is not meant to be precise to 2 decimal points. And so, yes, averages of polls are a little bit better, but when you see Trump up by 1 or Harris up by 1, it don't read too much into it. Pollsters don't want you to read too much into it, and it's not because they're bad or worried they're making a mistake. It's just not what that product is meant to deliver when you're thinking about precision. I think a very good way of thinking about this, and I'm stealing this line from Ben Wickler of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, is that all of these polls are within the margin of effort, which means they're close enough that it's pretty darn clear to everybody involved that What volunteers do over the next 8 days is going to determine everything. All right. I think that's it. Unless, Peter, do we have one more quick one or should we call it a day?
One more quick one.
Okay.
And I have it teed up. If people want to make calls between now and GOTV, so between now and the end of Thursday,
Yep.
can they do that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Go to environmentalvoter.org or go to the link that Peter will put in the chat, and you can see we have on our Get Involved page a whole bunch of phone banks that you can sign up for. And I can brag about this because I have nothing to do with it. Our organizers have made it so easy for you to get involved. You click on an event, you enter in your name and your email, and you will get a Zoom link. You show up to the Zoom, you'll get trained, they'll hold your hand until you're ready to do it. You'll be using scripts that have been proven in randomized control trials to increase turnout. No one will see your phone number. It's not your cell phone number that pops up. It's our phone number that pops up when you call these people. And you can make a difference. And perhaps what's most important is all of this nerdy data, well, not all of it, but a lot of this nerdy data that you just saw, we always let our volunteers know what their impact is. We always report back to them and saying, hey, this is how many calls you made, or this is the impact that you made. And so you'll be able to see yourself making a difference. And so I just want to close by saying two things. One, on Thursday, we have another one of these webinars if you want to check in and see what's happening with early vote data. But two, you are never going to get the next 8 days back. And I'm sorry, I know everybody's anxious, and maybe I shouldn't put it that way. But guys, like, time is now so clearly everybody's most precious commodity. Use your time in a way that has an impact. You can volunteer today and call voters. You can volunteer tomorrow. And certainly over those last 5 days, sign up for multiple phone banks if you can. All right. Thank you all so, so much. Thank you, Peter. And thank you to all of our volunteers and donors who are making all of this great stuff happen. We've already got almost, what, 150,000? Well, it was more than that. I forget how many we've gotten to vote already. We've gotten a lot to vote, almost 250,000. That's it. First-time climate voters to the polls. Thank you for that. Let's get 250,000 more before GOTV starts. Bye, folks.